God's timetable, not surprisingly, is different from ours. Is one that is incomprehensible, not surprising to us, because God had no beginning. He is, as Psalms 90 brings out, he is from eternal to eternal. He had no creator. He was not created. Now, some, of course, they find this hard to believe, and I understand. Being people as we are, just humans, it's hard to comprehend that. But in reality, when people really think about it, they come to understand that's the only way things could have happened, is that, as many will say, to be neutral, they'll say first cause. But the first cause had to have no beginning. Evolution, they try to say it was the Big Bang, some mindless force that made all these various creations. That you have to call it creation because there's design, there's complexity, there's order. And surely if you don't want, if just anyone cannot operate on you, it takes someone with experience to do so. It would take someone, an intelligent designer, to have made it. And the Creator is the logical answer to how all things came about, and his having no beginning is the logical conclusion. And so when we come to understand that, we can appreciate that his timetable is far grander than we can comprehend. In Psalms 90 verse 4, it tells us how God's view of just 1,000 years. It says, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. So just imagine that. A day that just gone by, that's how short 1,000 years is to God. Not trying to give you some way to calculate God's calendar, but just giving you a reference point of how God views time. Our days, in Psalm 90 verse 10, we're just 70, maybe 80 years. That's nothing. We're just a breath and we're gone. But imagine that 1,000 years is just like a day that's gone by. In the book of Peter, chapter 3, verse 8 and 9, he refers back to the psalmist and reminds us that God is not slow in keeping his promise, but he doesn't want anyone to be destroyed, but to come to repentance. Many of us today, we don't have such a loving attitude. We'd rather see people die. But God is merciful and he wants people to repent. And it helps to remind us that God's not slow. But you have to remember his timetable is different from ours. 1,000 years are like a day. In other words, it's not saying that 1,000 years is one day to God. It's telling us, as the psalmist did, that God, 1,000 years is a short period of time to God. It's like a day that just passed by. It's like a human day. You work all day, you work an 8-hour shift or something like that, or watch during the night. That's how short 1,000 years is to God. So these verses here help us to appreciate the grandness of God's timetable. It's not something to help us to make some sort of a calculation like the Watchtower did. I can recall reading a publication they had back in the 60s, and it was calculating, since a day, they were saying that a day was 1,000 years to God. That's not what the Psalms were saying. This was the publication, All Scriptures Inspired. We'd call it the Inspired Book. And I used to read it. As I read the Bible book, I would go to it and read the comments and other things, because it would have each chapter in that, in what we call the Inspired Book, it had each Bible book, what it said, a review of it, and so forth. So I went through each one as I finished the Bible book. But in Genesis, they were making the statement that having this calculation that they came up with, which was not in the Bible. God never said a day, his day is 1,000 years, but they said it. And they came up with something that that when it came to the days of creation in Genesis chapter 1, that each of those days was 7,000 years long. And with that particular calculation, they calculated further that 1975 would be 6,000 years of human existence, and they expected something to happen in 1975. Now, what verse they got that from? There was no verse. They just made that up, because God never told them how long each creative day is. Some have said 24 hours each creative day. God never said any of that. It's not possible for us to make God's calendar equal like ours. Genesis 1 tells us that God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. And so it doesn't tell us how long it took him. It just made that statement. He created in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then Genesis 1 and 2, after the earth was created, God noticed the earth. It says, now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So here we can see that there was preparation. Creative things were going to take place for 6 days that were to happen to prepare the earth for life and to put life upon the earth. And these things happened. Each day ended with God saying it is good, an evening and a morning, and the end now of that particular day. But what don't we ever see in the Bible? Well, first of all, we see in Genesis that God rested on the seventh day. Okay, so it's resting on the seventh day. But what we never read in the Bible anywhere is that he ever ended the seventh day. But the Bible continually shows that God has been resting since the seventh day began. And that ones, as Hebrews chapter 4 and chapter 3 bring out, can enter God's rest by desisting from their own works. And so what it's showing us is that, first of all, we don't know how long each creative day was, because God never said. It's based on his timetable, not ours. The Bible never concludes the seventh day. And so no one can say it is ended, because it hasn't. God's rest continues, and people have the opportunity to enter that rest, as the book of Hebrews brings out. What we understand, therefore, is this, that those creative days were not 24 hours. We don't know how long each one was, but if the seventh day involved all these thousands of years, those other days could well have involved thousands of years per day. How many, we don't know. The Bible never says. That's God's knowledge, and he hasn't told us that. So one day, God will end the seventh day, and we will hear that expression was made. It is good, an evening and a morning, a seventh day. Now, after the creation of all things, we know Adam and Eve spent some time in the garden. We don't know how long, but after a while they rebelled and they were put out of the garden. And since that particular period of time, the wickedness and violence increased, as Genesis chapter 6 showed us. And God told the man Noah that there'd be 120 years, and then the end would come. So he actually told when it would happen. So in that particular period of time, Noah, known as a preacher of righteousness, would of course warn people, try to help them understand what's going to happen. And he also was engaged in the building work of a 3-story ark for the survival of animals and all obedient humans. And so this happened, this worldwide flood happened. Noah and his family survived the flood, 8 people. Noah lost, of course, family members who did not listen to him and did not come into the ark. He might have heard them banging on the door, trying to get in. But Noah couldn't open the door because God closed it. Later on, we learn of Abraham and how he received promises from God. The years of affliction the Israelites would suffer, and then eventually they're being brought out of bondage from Egypt. Further, we learned in the book of Daniel, the weeks of years, the Bible speaks of the 70 weeks of years that would culminate in the Messiah coming, and also the end of the sacrifices, and this would happen. And so those things took place. Jesus came on time by his ministry, he fulfilled God's will. His death and resurrection brought about the beginning of the last days, as Peter brought out in Acts chapter 2. Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, because his disciples were asking about a sign in regards when these things would happen, the conclusion of the system of things. Well, Jesus gave them what he could tell them. He told them everything they would have to endure until the end. And he talked about a generation, as he said, this generation. And every time he said this generation, he applied to the generation of his time. And that generation experienced his words of destruction that took place. But yet Christians would continue to have to endure, even beyond that, all the things that Jesus said they would have to endure, also preaching the good news of the kingdom. And so in all this time that has gone by, there has never been an announcement by God, the ending of the seventh day. But we do have markers here in regards to last days and how close we're getting. The Bible talks about these 7 kings in Revelation chapter 13 and chapter 17. It tells us about the 7th head, that's that kingdom that would come about. Daniel chapter 2 likens that kingdom to feet of iron and clay, that kingdom that would be there when destruction would happen. And we see that that kingdom of iron and clay would show it's of iron and clay because of the mixture of humans engaged in the governing. As we see with America today, government by the people and for the people, and we see that happening. So this is a marker to show how far we are in the last days. Of course, the Bible speaks of this image of the wild beast that would require one's getting a mark, the mark of the beast. And one would have to understand what that mark is by proper calculation, spiritual understanding. We know that that mark of the beast will involve not being able to buy or sell if you don't have that mark. And we can see that concept today with America putting sanctions on governments that do not comply with what it wants. But as we look at, even so, we don't know how this is going to work out, but banks that want to have only digital currency, being able to control all the money no matter what. If that, we don't know how far that will go, but perhaps that too will play a part in making sure ones cannot buy or sell if they do not have the mark of the beast. During that time of not being able to buy or sell, we perhaps will see the fulfillment of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 10, verse 41 through 42. It says, "Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward." So during that particular time of not being able to buy and sell, which will further show how deeper and deeper we're in the last days, there may well be many acts of kindness by others that will be remembered. The nations, the Bible speaks of further, nations turning against this Babylon the Great, this great harlot, giving the authority to the image of the wild beast to put an end to it. And so when that takes place, then you know even further you're in the last days. And then, of course, when Jesus appears in the sky, and all nations will see him and bring about the end of this wicked world, and the birds will have a grand feast. During the 1,000 years, then the 1,000 years will begin, and mankind will be under the rule of Jesus and his associate rulers, bringing mankind back to what they had lost by means of Adam and Eve. And so we can see eventually how everything is ending up to where God will say it is good. And when his purpose is completed, all things are made new. He will say it is good. But again, he will end the seventh day at his own choosing. After 1,000 years, the Bible shows there will be a time when the devil will be let out to mislead the nations, to test the nations, and many will fall victim to that, even after the benefits of the 1,000-year rule of Jesus. And then that will bring the end of the devil, he being thrown into a death of no return, and all those who follow him. And after that, the earth will be able to maintain peace and security under God's rule. So everything will end according to God, what he wants. That statement will be made that it is good. And God will end the seventh day when he gets ready to. So therefore, since our time period on earth is very short, we cannot afford to be captured by false teachers and false prophets. As Jesus says, see that you're not deceived. I mean, it's like going down, driving your car, and you only got so much gas, and you take a wrong turn, and no gas stations in sight. That can be a very hard thing, and you got to turn around. We just don't have time for that. We don't have time to allow ourselves to fall victim to the various false teachers and false prophets that Jesus said would come. So it's all the more important, and very important instruction Jesus gave, see that you're not deceived. But we're not studying the Bible as a family and making it our focus and avoiding the bad association of this world. How can we avoid wasting time that we have so short of? So therefore, we have to understand that if you put your trust in men, you give human authorities unquestioned authority over your life, you're going to take a detour that you're not supposed to take. And it's going to waste time, years. Jesus said, you will know the truth, and truth will set you free. You must be able to prove the truth. And that'll help you from making wasted efforts in listening to humans who are not teaching the truth. So you must prove all things. This is something that we have to be added. There's no time for spiritual laziness. We have to make sure, because we have the truth. 2 Corinthians 13:8 says, nothing can be done against it. We'll be able to stand, prove it. We'll show that we know what we're doing. We know what we're worshiping. We're not worshiping what we don't know, but we worship what we know, because we don't have to run from the questions. We can answer them based on the scripture. A lot of time people take these wrong detours and waste time because they're engaged in, again, trust in man, putting trust in the flesh, in money, or in word nationality, skin color, and all these kind of things. All these things waste your time. They keep you from the truth. They keep you from knowing what is right. And you just waste a bunch of time. And so you have to, as the Bible said, you got to live by the Spirit. You can't live by the flesh. You can't afford the time. We only live 70, 80 years. Some of us don't even get that. So we can't just say, well, because my preacher said it, my mother and father said it, or some religious pride or whatever. No, we got to be doing as the Bible says, to make sure of all things, to prove all things. And therefore, in our short life, we'll be able to make a name for ourselves before God. Even though we're here just a short time, He will see when we make the statement that we're going to obey Him rather than man. And so may we do that and enjoy the benefits that come from obeying God even in this wicked system, and have the opportunity, of course, to live past the destruction of this world into the 1,000-year rule of Jesus Christ. Thank you.